For years, it's been something that Russia could use to devastate Ukraine. Vast swarms of drones and missiles have been used to strike Ukraine's cities and shatter its infrastructure. However, necessity is the mother of invention, and Ukraine has developed into the best in the world at countering the one thing that Russia relied on. Ukraine is swatting down everything that flies, combining mastery of a key air defense system with new technologies that are having a huge impact on Ukraine's interception rate. First, we take you to the night of April 15th. On that night, Russia launched yet another of its long-range attacks against Ukraine. It wasn't the largest aerial strike that Russia had unleashed. By the end of the attack, Ukraine worked out that Russia had launched a trio of Iskander-M ballistic missiles at its territory from the Rostov region, along with 234 strike drones, which included a swarm of 250 Shahid-type drones. Those drones flew from 7 different locations inside Russia and the occupied territories, which makes Russia's goal clear: overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses with drones so that the missiles could get through. It's a strategy that Russia has used to great effect before. However, on this night, Ukraine had the perfect counter. In less than an hour, Ukraine's air defenses intercepted all 3 of the Iskander-M missiles that Russia launched. On top of that, Ukraine took out 309 of the incoming Russian drones. It was also tracking 3 others that were still in Ukrainian airspace but appear to have lost their way en route to their targets. Assuming those 3 get taken down, the maths behind this defense tells an interesting story. For the missiles alone, Ukraine achieved a 100% interception rate. On the drone front, only 13 of Russia's unmanned aerial vehicles managed to get through to their intended targets, United 24 media reports. That leaves 311 that failed, which gives Ukraine an interception rate of 95.9%. Add the ballistic missiles and drones together, and that interception rate climbs to 96%. Right in line with the 95% that Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov wants his country to achieve. This is a headline in its own right. Ukraine has set a massive target and has achieved it. That alone is an indicator that Ukraine has built world-class air defenses, which is a topic that we're going to be exploring in more depth later. However, there's an aspect of this story that has caught everybody off guard. Ukraine intercepted all 3 of Russia's ballistic missiles. That's newsworthy in terms of saving Ukrainian citizens from a whole lot of destructive Russian force. But that isn't the most important part of the story. How Ukraine is managing to carry out these types of interceptions is the true proof that it's become a master of an air defense system that wasn't even designed on its territory. Ukraine would likely have destroyed Russia's ballistic missiles with Patriot interceptors, and it's using those interceptors in a way that bucks the entire doctrine of the US and NATO. All was revealed by a unit commander of a Ukrainian formation that operates Patriot air defense systems, who recently spoke to Air Command West, which is part of Ukraine's Air Force. That unit commander revealed that Ukraine has found a way to make its Patriot missile stockpiles last longer, and it's done so by becoming the most efficient user of the Patriot system to date. How? It all comes down to the typical rules of engagement for using the Patriot to take out a target. The official NATO protocols call for the users of a Patriot system to fire between 2 and 4 interceptor missiles at whatever is coming their way. There's plenty of logic behind this doctrine. The more interceptors you fire, the greater chance of at least one of those missiles taking out the target. The challenge emerges when you have a limited number of interceptor missiles and a large number of targets that need to be shot out of the sky. Ukraine has found a solution to that challenge, and it's a solution that bucks all conventions. We try to use as few missiles as possible. Even if the rules of engagement call for the use of 2 to 4 missiles against certain difficult targets, we destroy them with 1, the unit commander claims in a video. What this tells us is that Ukraine's Patriot crews have managed to refine their targeting and engagement capabilities beyond anything that the US or NATO thought possible. The 2 to 4 doctrine was created in part because NATO knew that crews operating the Patriot wouldn't have extensive experience using the system outside of training. A much different reality has emerged in Ukraine. Russia's non-stop aerial assaults mean that Ukraine's Patriot crews are combat-tested to a degree that no other users of the American air defense system could hope to be. The old adage says that practice makes perfect. Ukraine has proven that, as constant practice has allowed it to figure out how to maximize its limited stockpiles of Patriot missiles. Think about what this means in terms of cost and scale. If Ukraine followed NATO doctrine on the night of April 15th, it would have needed to rattle off up to 12 Patriot interceptors to deal with the 3 Iskander-M ballistic missiles that Russia launched. Costs vary depending on the type of interceptor that Ukraine launched. RBC Ukraine says that a PAC-3 missile costs between $3 million and $4 million. The US Congress says that the cost of a Patriot interceptor falls into the higher end of that spectrum, which means that following the NATO doctrine for Patriot usage would have cost Ukraine up to $48 million to halt 1 Russian strike. But Ukraine is going missile for missile. Rather than $48 million, Ukraine would have spent a maximum of $12 million to take out the trio of Russian Iskander-M ballistic missiles on April 15th. According to Pravda, an Iskander-M ballistic missile costs around $3 million. Ukraine was still on the losing end in terms of the cost battle. However, its mastery of the Patriot air defense system means that it was only in the red by $3 million at the end of April 15th, rather than the $39 million gap Ukraine would have to deal with if it followed NATO doctrine. This is where the mechanics of scale come into play, not just for Ukraine. The US, NATO, and the Middle East nations that use Patriot missile interceptors will all be looking at what Ukraine has just achieved, and they'll be asking questions. Chief among them is how necessary it is to use 4 missiles for a single target. NATO says that's what's needed, but Ukraine is proving with its Patriots that you can do with 1 what NATO says needs between 2 and 4. If other nations can mirror Ukraine's success, they can drastically reduce the cost of using their Patriot interceptors, as well as take out more targets before their stockpiles are depleted. The US should be asking Ukraine how it does it. According to the European Consortium for Political Research, the US used over 800 Patriot missiles during the first 3 days of Operation Epic Fury. If the US had the sort of mastery over its own weapon that Ukraine has developed, it could have used between 200 and 400 instead. Even at the lower end of the NATO doctrine spectrum, which would see the US using 2 interceptors per target, that's a saving of $1.6 billion. These massive cost savings are one of the reasons why Ukraine becoming the best in the world at using the Patriot could be crucial for both itself and its allies. There is another which is more focused on Ukraine itself. But before we get to that, Defense Blog offers some interesting information that it has gleaned from the Facebook video in which Ukraine's use of 1 interceptor per ballistic missile was revealed. It says that the Patriot launch unit shown in the video is being configured so that it can carry 2 PAC-2 Patriot interceptors, along with 4 PAC-3s. Though both are usable by a Patriot system, these missiles work very differently. The PAC-2, as the name implies, is the older of the two. It destroys its target via proximity detonation, which means that the PAC-2's warhead explodes as the missile approaches the incoming threat, with the resulting fragmentation leading to the destruction of the threat. PAC-3 missiles have a hit-to-kill approach, which is what it says on the tin. The interceptor collides directly with the incoming target before its warhead explodes. PAC-3 missiles require more accuracy, but they also produce more reliable results. PAC-2 interceptors sacrifice a touch of reliability for a greater chance to score a hit on an incoming threat, even if that hit doesn't take the threat out. However, Ukraine is operating both. The commander didn't specify which type of interceptor missiles Ukraine is using in its one-for-one strategy, which leads us to an interesting conclusion: it's able to use both. If that's the case, Ukraine has figured out how best to utilize the strengths of each type of interceptor in ways that nobody else has, which requires an exceptional level of target tracking and fire control timing. And remember, this is all being done against ballistic missiles that can travel at several times the speed of sound. The level of discipline and operational refinement needed to pull off something like this is insane. At this point, there's no arguing against the fact that Ukraine is the best in the world at using the Patriot air defense system. But the other wrinkle to this story, and the second reason why this is so important for Ukraine, is that this is a skill born as much out of necessity as it is the result of growing expertise. Before we explain what that means, this is a quick reminder that you're watching The Military Show. If you want to see more of this kind of insight, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. So Ukraine is cutting down on costs and increasing its kill counts through its mastery of the Patriot interceptor. The real reason why this matters, for Ukraine perhaps more than any other nation, is that Ukraine doesn't have enough Patriot missiles to follow the NATO doctrine. It has received as many as its allies can provide, with the US, Germany, and the Netherlands all having provided interceptors from their stockpiles. However, the production of Patriot missiles is finite. Plus, with the US having tied itself up in a war with Iran that has seen it use huge numbers of Patriot missiles, stockpiles that might have gone to Ukraine are instead being used to take out Iranian Shahid drones. By reducing missile expenditure by a factor of up to 4, Ukraine is conserving ammunition that is in very, very short supply. Ukraine knows that it isn't likely to get a reliable source of Patriot interceptors for a while. The US, which was Ukraine's main source, needs as many of its missiles as it can for its campaign in Iran. Worse yet for Ukraine, US Vice President J.D. Vance went on record in mid-April to proclaim that ending military aid to Ukraine was one of the proudest achievements of his time in the Trump administration. If that's the case, Ukraine seemingly can't rely on the US to restart military aid or to provide more Patriot missiles as and when they're needed. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky pulls no punches when he talks about Ukraine's Patriot missile shortages. The situation is in such a deficit, it could not be any worse, Zelensky declared in the wake of Vance's comments. If Ukraine's Patriot interceptor situation is as dire as Zelensky says, then its mastery of the system is a necessity. Ukraine simply can't afford to burn through more Patriot missiles than it needs to counter Russia's ballistic missile threat. Stockpile woes aside, what Ukraine's revolutionary use of the Patriot shows us is that the country's air defense strategy has evolved to the point where it's now among the best in the world. The Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, highlights that in an April 13th piece where it labels Ukraine's air defenses as world-class, while noting that those air defenses are still improving. And though Ukraine's doctrine-bucking use of the Patriot is the example that we've focused on for most of the video, there is something else that Ukraine has added to its air defense game that makes it the envy of the rest of the world: interceptor drones. Though dealing with ballistic missiles still amounts to firing expensive missiles at expensive threats, the real challenge for Ukraine lies in Russia's use of Shahid-type attack drones, both for strikes and to confuse air defense systems that should be focusing on missiles. As we saw on April 15th, Russia launches hundreds of Shahid drones alongside its missiles during its airstrikes. Even Ukraine's hyper-efficiency with its Patriot systems can't account for that. Billions of dollars would be blown up in the skies if Ukraine started using Patriot missiles to counter Shahids, and the stockpile issues that are critical for Ukraine right now would be a non-factor. Ukraine wouldn't even have stockpiles to speak of. Interceptor drones have changed the game for Ukraine's air defense, and they would have been a huge factor in Ukraine achieving the 96% interception rate we spoke about earlier during Russia's April 15th attack. The numbers say it all. On April 8th, Fedorov noted that Ukraine's interceptor drones destroyed 33,000 of Russia's strike drones in March. That number covers unmanned aerial vehicles of all types, not just the long-range Shahid drones that Russia launches. 33,000 is also twice as many drones as Ukraine's interceptors destroyed during the previous month, and this drone destruction is likely why Ukraine's overall drone interception rate rose to 89.9% in March. February saw that rate hit 85.6%, which was already a substantial improvement over the 80.2% rate recorded back in December. This pattern is also paired with the fact that Russia has been launching more drones at Ukraine, CEPA points out. March alone saw Russia fire 28% more drones at Ukraine, and Ukraine still intercepted more of them. Ukraine's mastery of air defense was cast into an even stronger spotlight by its Ministry of Defense. The 89.9% interception rate covers both missiles and drones. If we only focus on Shahid-type drones, then Russia fired 6,463 at Ukraine in March, of which 5,835 were intercepted. That amounts to an interception rate of 90.25%, which is incredible given the sheer volume of drones that Russia is launching. But here's where Ukraine's interceptor drones really shine. They cost far less than Russia's Shahid-type drones. According to Euronews, a single interceptor drone costs Ukraine between €1,000 and €4,000, or around $1,170 to $4,700 to make. A Russian Shahid costs between €25,000 and €40,000, or $29,400 and $47,000 to build. Both are low-cost weapons. Shahids costing so little is the main reason why using multi-million-dollar missiles to counter them, as the US has been doing in Iran, leads to a country burning through billions of dollars in a matter of days. But with its interceptor drones, Ukraine has developed a counter to the Shahids that costs as little as a 20th of what Russia is spending on building its long-range drones. What we're seeing from Ukraine right now is that it's tackling the core challenge of modern air defense. That challenge isn't taking out big missiles with expensive interceptors, though that is still a part of the overall problem. The far greater challenge is finding the balance between cost and volume. Russia has already done that on the strike end. A handful of missiles combined with hundreds of drones allows Russia to hit hard without spending as much as it would if it relied on missiles alone. The irony here is that Ukraine has taken this approach and applied it to defense. Ukraine is also using fewer missiles and more drones. Only its interceptor drones are so cheap that they eliminate any benefit that Russia experienced from using its Shahids in the first place. Shahid drones were supposed to make airstrikes cheaper for Russia and more expensive for Ukraine. Now the tables have turned, and it's Russia that is losing more money than Ukraine every time it attacks from the skies. None of this happened overnight. Ukraine has become a master of air defenses because Russia's attacks over the last few years have forced it to figure out ways to counter the sheer volume. Interceptor drones, Patriot missiles, and much more are now part of a layered air defense model that the former chairman of Ukraine's Artificial Intelligence Committee, Vitaly Goncharuk, says was developed over 18 months that also saw Ukraine boost its propeller-driven drone output significantly. Ukraine has figured out the trick to air defense, which is that there is no single, correct system to use against the Russian threat. There are several tools, each of which can be used against a specific type of weapon that Russia unleashes. There are still challenges ahead. Russia is moving toward using Shahid-type drones equipped with jet engines, which are supposed to make them faster and thus more difficult to intercept. But Ukraine is even rising to that challenge. On April 14th, Militani reported that Ukraine's interceptor drones are already taking out Russia's newer jet-powered drones. Ukraine is also working on laser-based air defense systems, which can tear through Russia's faster drones at almost zero cost. These types of weapons are still in their prototype phases, but the fact that they're being developed at all shows us that Ukraine's mastery of air defense hasn't only occurred because it's the best in the world at using existing systems. Ukraine is developing brand new weapons to answer every air defense question that Russia tries to raise. With all of this in mind, is it any wonder that Ukraine is now being courted by some pretty major players who want to get their hands on its air defense secrets? Ukraine's interceptor drones, combined with its 4 years of experience in dealing with Russian Shahed-type drones, are the reason why Gulf states are signing defense deals with Ukraine. These deals, which Ukraine has signed with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, each last for a decade and have already led to Ukraine sending over 200 anti-drone experts to the Middle East in March. But the really important thing about these deals is what Ukraine gets in return. Weapons, fuel, and cash are all coming Ukraine's way, as is a new level of influence in the Middle East that Ukraine has never had before. That's what being the best in the world gets you. As Ukraine continues to improve its layered air defense strategy, as it makes its use of Western systems more efficient than anybody thought they could be, it's developing expertise that it can leverage for its military's gain. Ukraine's air defense is already protected directly, but with that leverage comes protection that arrives in the form of fuel and cash, which are countering Russia's strategy of wearing Ukraine down. There's a lot more to say about the Gulf deals, by the way. Ukraine's air defense expertise is so extensive that it may be the key to reopening the Strait of Hormuz if Operation Epic Fury reignites. Hard-won experiences of blockades in the Black Sea are also making Ukraine a valuable partner for many in the Middle East, and you can find out why by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the Military Show to see more analysis of how Putin's invasion is playing a part in turning Ukraine into one of the world's most respected military powers. And thank you as always for watching.